The year is 1457 before Christ. Egypt, a land of endless deserts and golden sun, is holding its breath. The kingdom is surrounded. Its enemies are many. Their armies are closing in. And at the center of it all stands a young pharaoh. Not yet a legend, not yet a name whispered through the centuries. Just a determined soul with everything to prove. The situation is desperate. Egypt's army is outnumbered. The enemy has formed a coalition, a wall of shields and spears from rebellious kingdoms, ready to erase Egypt's glory from the map. Most rulers would have hesitated, maybe even surrendered. But this pharaoh, Thutmose III, chooses another path. He calls his generals together. They argue for caution, for the safer roads. But Thutmose has spent his life waiting for this moment, learning in the shadows, watching and preparing. He studies the map. There is a mountain pass, narrow, twisted, dangerous. It is the last route anyone would ever choose, and that is exactly why Thutmose chooses it. Picture a line of Egyptian warriors moving quietly through this winding corridor of stone, the dawn barely lighting their path. Every step is a gamble. If they are discovered, it could all be over. But the enemy, comfortable in their camp, never expects danger from such an impossible direction. By the time they realize what is happening, it is too late. The battle is swift, the outcome unexpected. By sunset, the young pharaoh stands victorious on the field, his enemies scattered. In a single day, Thutmose III transforms from an untested ruler into the master of Egypt's fate. But this story is more than a single daring battle. How does a boy, once hidden in the shadow of his powerful stepmother, rise to become the first great conqueror in history? What drives a person to build an empire meant to last 1,000 years? And why, after so many centuries, does the name Thutmose still echo in the sands of Egypt? Before we journey deeper into this epic tale, before we uncover the secrets of Thutmose the Great, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Legacy of Empires, and tap the bell icon. That way, you will never miss a story carved from the very heart of history. So, are you ready to step into the world of ancient Egypt, where destiny is forged in courage and cunning? Let's begin. Picture this. You're born into the most powerful kingdom on earth, but the crown that should be yours slips through your fingers like sand. This was the reality for young Thutmose, a boy who would grow up watching someone else sit on his throne. When Thutmose II died unexpectedly, Egypt faced a crisis. The rightful heir was just a child, barely old enough to understand what kingship meant. In stepped Hatshepsut, his stepmother, who would become one of history's most remarkable female rulers. But here's what makes this story fascinating. She didn't just serve as a temporary guardian. She took the throne completely, declaring herself pharaoh and ruling Egypt for over 2 decades. Imagine being that young prince, growing up in the shadow of such a powerful woman. While Hatshepsut was revolutionizing Egypt, building magnificent temples and establishing trade routes that brought incredible wealth to the kingdom, Thutmose was learning a different kind of lesson. Every day he watched and waited, absorbing everything about leadership, strategy, and the delicate art of ruling an empire. What's remarkable is how he spent those years. Ancient records tell us he wasn't idle or bitter. Instead, he threw himself into military training, studying the tactics of Egypt's greatest generals, learning languages of neighboring kingdoms, and understanding the complex web of diplomacy that held the ancient world together. Some historians believe this extended apprenticeship actually shaped him into a far greater leader than he might have become otherwise. But here's where the story takes a mysterious turn. Around 1458 before Christ, Hatshepsut simply disappeared from the historical record. Her monuments were systematically defaced, her name chiseled away from temple walls, her statues buried or destroyed. For decades, scholars debated whether Thutmose orchestrated this erasure out of revenge, or if it happened much later for entirely different reasons. Recent archaeological evidence suggests the truth might be more complex and less dramatic than we once thought. Many of Hatshepsut's monuments weren't destroyed immediately after her death, but years later, possibly as part of a campaign to legitimize Thutmose's own reign or to clarify the royal succession for future generations. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with maintaining cosmic order, and having a female pharaoh might have seemed like a disruption that needed to be corrected in the official records. What we do know is this: when Thutmose finally took his rightful place on the throne, he was no ordinary ruler. Those 22 years of waiting hadn't weakened him. They had forged him into something unprecedented. He possessed not just the divine authority of a pharaoh, but the practical wisdom of someone who had studied power from the outside, understanding both its potential and its limitations. The young man who emerged from Hatshepsut's shadow carried with him a burning ambition to prove that he was worthy of the throne that had been delayed, but never denied. He would soon show the world that sometimes the greatest leaders are those who have learned patience before they learn to conquer. And conquer he would, in ways that would reshape not just Egypt, but the entire ancient world. News travels fast in the ancient world, especially bad news. Word had spread across the eastern Mediterranean that Egypt had a new pharaoh, and to many, he seemed like easy prey. The coalition of Canaanite city-states, led by the powerful fortress of Megiddo, saw an opportunity they couldn't resist. Here was an untested ruler who had spent decades in his stepmother's shadow. Surely, they thought, this was their moment to break free from Egyptian control. What they didn't realize was that they were about to face someone who had been preparing for this exact moment his entire life. When the rebellion reached Thutmose's ears, he faced his first major test as pharaoh. He could have sent diplomats, offered concessions, or waited for the revolt to burn itself out. Instead, he made a decision that would define not just his reign, but military strategy for centuries to come. He would lead his army personally into enemy territory, something that shocked even his own advisors. The journey north took the Egyptian army through challenging terrain, but the real test came when they reached the Carmel mountain range. Here's where this story becomes absolutely fascinating. Thutmose was presented with 3 possible routes to reach Megiddo. 2 of these paths were relatively safe, winding around the mountains and allowing his forces to approach with minimal risk. The third route, however, was a narrow mountain pass called Aruna, barely wide enough for his chariots to pass through single file. Picture the scene. Seasoned generals, men who had served under previous pharaohs, gathered around their young king as he studied the terrain. They had good reasons to worry about the narrow pass. If the enemy discovered their approach, the entire Egyptian army could be trapped in a deadly bottleneck, unable to retreat or advance effectively. It would be a massacre. But Thutmose saw something his generals missed. He understood that his enemies were thinking exactly like his own advisors. They would expect him to take the safer routes, and they had positioned their forces accordingly. The pass at Aruna was so dangerous that no rational commander would attempt it, which made it, paradoxically, the safest choice of all. Here's a detail that really brings this moment to life. Ancient Egyptian records actually preserve some of the conversation between Thutmose and his commanders. They pleaded with him to reconsider, arguing that the reputation of Egypt's military might was at stake. If their pharaoh died in some remote mountain pass, the entire kingdom would be vulnerable to invasion. Thutmose listened to their concerns, but his response reveals the brilliant strategic mind that would make him legendary. He essentially told them that surprise was worth more than safety, that the enemy's overconfidence would become their greatest weakness. He had spent years studying military campaigns, and he understood something that would later become a fundamental principle of warfare. Sometimes the most dangerous path is actually the safest, because it's the one your enemy least expects. The march through Aruna must have been nerve-wracking for everyone involved. The Egyptian army moved in a long, vulnerable line, with scouts ahead and behind, listening for any sign that they had been discovered. For hours, they wound through the narrow defile, knowing that at any moment they might face disaster. But when they finally emerged from the pass, they found something beautiful. The enemy coalition spread out across the plains below, completely unprepared for their arrival. The forces of Megiddo had indeed positioned themselves to guard the safer routes, leaving their rear completely exposed. What happened next changed the balance of power in the ancient Near East. The Egyptian attack was swift and decisive, catching the enemy forces in complete disarray. The coalition army, so confident just hours before, found themselves facing the Pharaoh's chariots and infantry from a direction they never imagined possible. The fortress of Megiddo itself fell after a brief siege, and with it, the entire rebellion collapsed. But more than that, the battle established Thutmose as a military genius whose reputation would spread throughout the known world. Kings and commanders from Syria to Nubia suddenly realized that Egypt's new pharaoh was unlike any ruler they had faced before. The victory at Megiddo wasn't just about superior tactics or courage, though Thutmose had both in abundance. It was about understanding human nature, recognizing that people often defeat themselves by thinking in predictable patterns. By choosing the path that seemed impossible, Thutmose had achieved something that seemed impossible: a perfect victory against overwhelming odds. And this was just the beginning. The young pharaoh, who had once waited patiently in the shadows, had announced himself to the world in the most dramatic way possible. The age of Egyptian expansion was about to begin. What would you have done at Megiddo? Let us know in the comments. And if you're loving this tale of ancient strategy, smash that like button, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. After Megiddo, something extraordinary happened. Most pharaohs would have returned to Egypt, content with their victory and the tribute it brought. But Thutmose had tasted something intoxicating: the thrill of expanding Egypt's boundaries beyond anything his ancestors had imagined. Over the next 2 decades, he would launch 17 military campaigns, and here's the remarkable thing: he never lost a single one. But what made Thutmose truly revolutionary wasn't just his success rate. It was how he completely reimagined what warfare could be. Think about it. For centuries, armies had been limited by how much food and equipment they could carry on their backs or load onto pack animals. Supply lines stretched like fragile threads across hostile territory, always vulnerable to attack. Thutmose looked at this age-old problem and saw an opportunity that no one else had noticed. Egypt controlled the eastern Mediterranean coastline, and the sea itself could become his highway. He began coordinating his land campaigns with naval support, using Egyptian ships to carry supplies, reinforcements, and siege equipment directly to coastal cities. This meant his armies could stay in the field for months instead of weeks, and they arrived at their destinations fresh and fully equipped, while their enemies were already exhausted from preparing defenses. Here's a detail that really shows his innovative thinking. Thutmose didn't just use ships for transport. He turned them into floating workshops and armories. Egyptian vessels would arrive at strategic ports ahead of the army, establishing supply depots and even prefabricating siege equipment that could be quickly assembled when needed. It was an early form of combined arms warfare that wouldn't be seen again until much later in history. But perhaps his most brilliant innovation was how he transformed the chariot from a simple transport vehicle into a devastating weapon of war. Previous armies had used chariots mainly for commanders to survey battlefields or as platforms for archers. Thutmose developed tactics that turned massed chariot formations into an ancient equivalent of tank divisions, using their speed and mobility to break enemy lines and create chaos in their ranks. The psychological impact was enormous. Imagine being an enemy soldier, standing in formation with your bronze-tipped spear, when suddenly the ground begins to shake with the thunder of hundreds of horse hooves and chariot wheels. The dust cloud rises on the horizon, and you realize that Egypt's pharaoh himself might be leading that charge, his golden war crown glinting in the sunlight. Yet for all his military innovations, Thutmose's greatest genius lay not in how he won battles, but in how he secured lasting peace afterward. And this is where his story becomes really fascinating from a human perspective. After each successful campaign, Thutmose would gather the defeated rulers and their families. Now, you might expect him to execute his enemies or humiliate them publicly. Instead, He did something that seemed almost gentle, but was actually brilliantly strategic. He would take the sons and daughters of conquered kings back to Egypt, not as prisoners, but as honored guests in the royal court. These young princes and princesses would grow up in Egyptian palaces, learning to speak Egyptian, worship Egyptian gods, and think of themselves as part of the pharaoh's extended family. They received the finest education available in the ancient world, studying mathematics, astronomy, literature, and statecraft alongside Egyptian nobility. Many of them probably had better lives in Egypt than they would have had in their homeland. But here's the genius of it. When these young people reached adulthood, Thutmose would send them back to rule their ancestral lands as Egyptian vassals. They returned home speaking Egyptian, thinking like Egyptians, and genuinely loyal to the pharaoh who had raised them. It was cultural diplomacy at its most sophisticated, creating a network of allied rulers who governed not out of fear, but out of genuine affection and shared identity. This system was so effective that some of these vassal kingdoms remained loyal to Egypt for generations, long after Thutmose himself had passed away. The sons and daughters he had raised went on to raise their own children with pro-Egyptian sympathies, creating a legacy of alliance that military conquest alone could never have achieved. There's something deeply human about this approach that speaks to Thutmose's character. Rather than ruling through terror, he chose to rule through relationship. He understood that people fight harder against oppression than they do against someone they consider family. By turning potential enemies into adopted children, he created something unprecedented in the ancient world. An empire held together not just by military might, but by genuine bonds of loyalty and affection. The results spoke for themselves. While other ancient empires constantly battled rebellions and uprisings, Thutmose's territories remained remarkably stable. His former enemies became his most trusted allies, and their kingdoms prospered under Egyptian protection and trade relationships. This combination of military innovation and diplomatic genius created something that had never existed before, a truly sustainable ancient empire. Thutmose hadn't just conquered territory. He had created a new model for how diverse peoples could coexist under a single crown, each maintaining their local customs while contributing to a greater whole. And perhaps most remarkably, he had done it all while maintaining Egypt's reputation not as a brutal oppressor, but as a civilizing force that brought prosperity and stability to the lands it touched. Here's what's fascinating about power. It reveals who you really are, not who you pretend to be. And when Thutmose gained absolute authority over one of the world's greatest civilizations, what emerged was a complex portrait of a ruler who understood that true strength comes not from fear, but from earning genuine devotion. To the outside world, Thutmose had cultivated a fearsome reputation. Enemy kingdoms spoke of him in hushed tones as the smiter of Asiatics, a title that spread terror from Syria to Sudan. Foreign diplomats arriving at his court would see towering obelisks covered in hieroglyphs celebrating his victories, massive statues depicting him trampling his enemies underfoot, and temple walls decorated with scenes of tribute bearers from distant lands bowing before Egypt's mighty Pharaoh. But step inside Egypt itself, and you'd discover something remarkable. This same man who struck fear into the hearts of foreign kings was beloved by his own people in ways that went far beyond mere respect for authority. The wealth flowing into Egypt from Thutmose's campaigns was staggering. Caravans arrived regularly from conquered territories, laden with gold from Nubian mines, silver from Anatolian mountains, exotic woods from Lebanese forests, and precious stones from lands so distant that most Egyptians had never heard their names. But here's what made Thutmose different from other conqueror kings. He didn't hoard this wealth in royal treasuries. Instead, he poured it back into Egypt itself. Walking through Thebes during Thutmose's reign must have been like witnessing a city being transformed into something magical. New temples rose toward the sky, their limestone walls gleaming white in the desert sun, their interiors filled with golden statues and elaborate paintings that told stories of divine protection and earthly prosperity. The famous temple complex at Karnak, already impressive, expanded dramatically under his rule, becoming a wonder that would inspire awe for thousands of years to come. But Thutmose understood something profound about leadership. Monuments alone don't create loyalty. People do. And he had a remarkable gift for making ordinary Egyptians feel that their pharaoh truly saw them, valued them, and remembered their contributions. Here's a detail that really brings this to life. Archaeologists have discovered inscriptions in Egyptian temples that do something almost unprecedented in the ancient world. They name individual soldiers, not just generals or nobles, but common foot soldiers and chariot drivers who had shown courage in battle. Think about that for a moment. In an age when most rulers barely acknowledged the existence of their subjects, Thutmose was having the names of brave farmers and craftsmen carved into stone for eternity. One inscription from his temple at Karnak mentions a soldier named Amenemheb, describing in detail how this ordinary man had saved the pharaoh's life during a campaign in Syria. The story tells how Amenemheb rushed forward to kill a charging elephant that threatened Thutmose during a battle, and how the grateful pharaoh rewarded him not just with gold, but with the honor of having his deed recorded permanently in the sacred temple. This wasn't just good politics, though it certainly was that. It reflected something deeper about Thutmose's character. He had spent those long years watching Hatshepsut rule, and he had learned that the most effective leaders are those who make their people feel like partners in something greater than themselves. The veterans of his campaigns didn't just return home with stories of victory. They came back with land grants, titles, and positions of honor in Egyptian society. Soldiers who had started as farmers' sons found themselves appointed as governors of newly conquered territories or administrators in the royal bureaucracy. The pharaoh, who had once been overlooked himself, made sure that bravery and loyalty, regardless of birth, would never go unnoticed. But perhaps most remarkably, Thutmose created something like an early social safety net. Temple records show that he established funds to support the families of soldiers who had died in his service, ensuring that their widows and children would never face poverty. Veterans who had been wounded in battle received pensions and medical care. It was a level of care for ordinary people that was revolutionary for its time. This combination of spectacular public works and personal attention to individual citizens created something extraordinary, a population that genuinely believed their pharaoh was not just their ruler, but their protector and champion. When Thutmose called for volunteers for his military campaigns, men lined up not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to serve a king who had proven he would remember their service and care for their families. The psychological impact was profound. Egyptian soldiers didn't just fight for territory or plunder. They fought for a leader who knew their names, honored their sacrifices, and shared his victories with them. This created a military culture where defeat was literally unthinkable, because letting down such a king would mean betraying not just a sovereign, but a protector and friend. Foreign ambassadors visiting Egypt during this period wrote back to their own rulers with a mixture of admiration and worry. They described a kingdom where the people seemed genuinely happy, where temples overflowed with offerings of gratitude, and where the pharaoh could walk among his subjects without fear because he was surrounded not by bodyguards, but by citizens who would willingly die to protect him. This was the secret behind Thutmose's incredible success. He hadn't just built an empire through military conquest, he had created a society where every person, from the highest noble to the humblest soldier, felt they had a stake in Egypt's greatness. And that kind of loyalty, once earned, becomes the most powerful weapon any ruler can possess. There's something deeply poignant about watching greatness face its final limitation. Thutmose had conquered kingdoms, expanded empires, and earned the devotion of millions. He had faced down enemy armies, navigated treacherous politics, and transformed Egypt into the ancient world's greatest superpower. But in 1426 before Christ, after 54 remarkable years on the throne, the pharaoh, who had never lost a battle, encountered the one opponent that no mortal can defeat. The final years of Thutmose's reign reveal a different side of this legendary ruler. As his strength began to fade, he didn't retreat into isolation or bitterness, as many aging monarchs do. Instead, he became something like a master craftsman, putting the finishing touches on his greatest work. He spent his time ensuring that Egypt would remain strong long after his death, carefully grooming his successor and establishing systems that would preserve his empire for generations to come. Ancient records tell us that even in his 70s, Thutmose remained mentally sharp and actively involved in governing Egypt. He continued to receive foreign ambassadors, review military reports, and make decisions about building projects that would outlast him by millennia. There's something deeply moving about imagining this elderly king, his hands perhaps trembling with age, still signing documents that would affect the lives of millions. When death finally came, it marked the end of an era in a way that few royal deaths ever do. The pharaoh who had expanded Egypt's borders to their greatest extent, who had filled the royal treasury with unprecedented wealth, and who had created a model of enlightened rulership, was laid to rest in a tomb that reflected both his achievements and his understanding of eternity. His burial place in the Valley of the Kings was chosen with the same strategic thinking that had characterized his military campaigns. Hidden deep in the desert cliffs across from Thebes, the tomb was designed to protect his mummy and treasures from the grave robbers who had plagued Egypt for generations. The location was so secret that even the workers who built it were sworn to secrecy, and some historians believe they may have been relocated to distant parts of the empire to ensure the tomb's location remained unknown. But here's where the story becomes fascinating from an archaeological perspective. Unlike many pharaohs whose tombs were discovered stripped bare by ancient thieves, Thutmose's final resting place remained largely intact for over 3,000 years. When modern archaeologists finally located and opened his tomb in the late 19th century, they found something extraordinary. Not just the pharaoh's mummy and grave goods, but a kind of time capsule that preserved the story of his remarkable reign. The tomb walls were covered with detailed inscriptions describing his military campaigns, complete with maps showing the routes his armies had taken and lists of the tribute paid by conquered kingdoms. Golden amulets bore the names of soldiers who had served him faithfully. Even his war chariot was buried with him, its bronze fittings still gleaming after millennia in the darkness. Yet perhaps the most remarkable discovery was Thutmose's mummy itself. Modern scientific analysis has revealed details about his life that no ancient historian could have recorded. We can see evidence of old battle wounds that had healed, suggesting he had indeed led from the front in his military campaigns. His bones show the wear patterns of someone who had spent countless hours riding in chariots and wielding weapons. Even in death, his body told the story of a king who had lived the life of a warrior. But Thutmose's true immortality lay not in his preserved remains, but in the legacy he created. Future pharaohs would measure themselves against his achievements, trying to match his military successes and emulate his building projects. The great Ramesses II, who ruled Egypt 3 centuries later, deliberately modeled many of his campaigns on Thutmose's strategies and even had scribes copy inscriptions from Thutmose's temples for his own monuments. Even more remarkably, Thutmose's reputation spread far beyond Egypt's borders and survived long after his civilization had faded. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt nearly 1,000 years after Thutmose's death, one of his first acts was to seek out the ancient pharaoh's tomb. According to historical accounts, Alexander believed that by visiting Thutmose's burial place and paying homage to his achievements, he could somehow absorb the strategic genius that had made the Egyptian king legendary. This wasn't mere superstition on Alexander's part. Military commanders throughout history have studied Thutmose's campaigns, recognizing innovations that remain relevant even today. His use of combined land and sea operations, his integration of different types of military units, and his understanding of psychological warfare all became fundamental principles that would be rediscovered and refined by later generals. Perhaps most importantly, Thutmose had proven that true leadership isn't about dominating others through fear, but about inspiring them to achieve greatness together. The empire he built lasted not because it was held together by military force, but because it was founded on relationships of mutual respect and shared prosperity. In the end, that may be Thutmose's greatest achievement. He showed the ancient world that a ruler could be both powerful and compassionate, both feared by enemies and beloved by subjects, both a brilliant strategist and a caring protector of his people. He created a model of leadership that transcended his own time and continues to inspire people today. The boy who had once waited patiently in the shadows had become a man whose light still shines across the centuries, reminding us that true greatness lies not in conquering others, but in lifting them up and creating something lasting that benefits generations yet to come. When we look back across more than 3,000 years of history, it's remarkable how clearly Thutmose's story still speaks to us today. Here was someone who could have easily become bitter about the hand life dealt him, who could have spent those 22 years of waiting nursing resentment and planning revenge. Instead, he transformed what seemed like a setback into the foundation for unprecedented greatness. Think about the lessons hidden in his extraordinary journey. When he stood before those three paths leading to Megiddo, he wasn't just choosing a military strategy. He was demonstrating something profound about human nature, that our greatest opportunities often disguise themselves as our most frightening challenges. The narrow pass that terrified his generals became the gateway to his legend, precisely because it seemed impossible. This pattern repeated throughout his reign. Where others saw obstacles, Thutmose saw possibilities. When faced with the challenge of governing distant territories, he didn't rely on the traditional methods of fear and oppression. Instead, he pioneered an approach based on relationship and respect that proved far more effective than anything his predecessors had attempted. When confronted with the logistics of extended military campaigns, he didn't accept the limitations that had constrained previous pharaohs. He reimagined what warfare could be, turning the sea itself into his ally. But perhaps most importantly, Thutmose understood something that many powerful people never grasp, that true strength comes not from what you can take from others, but from what you can inspire them to give willingly. The soldiers who carved his name on temple walls weren't just recording military victories. They were expressing genuine gratitude to a leader who had remembered their names, honored their sacrifices, and shared his triumphs with them. There's something deeply relevant about this in our own time. We live in an age where leadership is often confused with dominance, where success is measured purely in personal achievement rather than collective progress. Thutmose's story reminds us that the most enduring accomplishments are those that lift others up along the way. His empire lasted for centuries, not because it was built on conquest, but because it was founded on the revolutionary idea that different peoples could prosper together under enlightened guidance. The young princes and princesses he raised in his court didn't just become loyal vassals. They became living bridges between cultures, creating networks of understanding that transcended national boundaries. Even his approach to remembering the past offers us wisdom for the present. Those detailed inscriptions in his temples weren't just monuments to his ego. They were historical records, carefully preserved accounts of what had worked and what hadn't. Lessons written in stone for future generations to study and learn from. Thutmose understood that knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied. When we consider the full arc of his life, from that overlooked boy in Hatshepsut's court to the pharaoh whose reputation reached the ears of Alexander the Great, we see a story that transcends its ancient setting. It's a reminder that circumstances don't define us. Our response to circumstances does. The same challenges that might have broken a lesser person became the very experiences that forged Thutmose into someone extraordinary. His legacy isn't just the territories he conquered or the monuments he built. It's the proof he left us that patience can be more powerful than aggression, that innovation can overcome tradition, and that true leadership means creating something larger than yourself. The pharaoh who had learned to wait in the shadows had taught the world that sometimes the greatest victories come to those who understand that timing, preparation, and wisdom matter more than raw ambition. Today, when his temples still stand proud against the Egyptian sky and his story still inspires people across the globe, Thutmose's greatest achievement becomes clear. He didn't just rule an empire, he created a model of what human potential looks like when it's guided by both strength and compassion, both vision and humility. The sands of time have indeed buried his kingdom, scattered his armies, and reduced his golden treasures to museum pieces. But they couldn't bury the most important thing he left behind: the understanding that greatness isn't about conquering others, but about discovering what becomes possible when we choose the difficult path. Trust in our preparation, and remember that our greatest victories are the ones we share with others. In the end, perhaps that's why his story still resonates so powerfully after all these centuries. Because deep down, we all face our own narrow passes, our own moments when we must choose between the safe path and the one that leads to something extraordinary. And when we do, we can remember the Shadow Prince who became a legend by daring to march toward the impossible, knowing that on the other side waited not just victory, but transformation. If this story of ambition and empire moved you, like the video, comment your thoughts below, and share it with those who love history's untold sagas, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires, because the past is full of legends waiting to be revived. Until next time, remember, the sands bury kingdoms, but not their stories.